Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jonathan Paskey, executive producer and co-founder at Dev Network.
Welcome back to the main stage, everybody, here at API World. We have our next networking break in which we have our fireside chat coming up here, our VIP fireside chat. We've got special guests, Eric Newcomer, CTO at WSO2, and Kyle Fowler. He is the Director of Developer and Consumer Experience at Foursquare. Guys, you want to join us here on the main stage?
Okay. Hey, John. Hey, Kyle.
Hey, Eric.
Hey, John.
Hey, Kyle. Hey.
How's it going?
Good to see you guys both.
Yeah.
So we're going to keep this pretty informal. This is one of our VIP fireside chats that we do here at our shows. The topic this time is API strategy. Technically, the topic that we're discussing is something generally like metrics and KPIs for measuring API products and project success over the years. And then how do you think API project success should be measured? So why don't we take the official question first, and then we'll just kind of branch it out from there. So Eric, you want to go first? Let's do some quick introductions, both of you guys, and then we'll go ahead and get to that question.
Okay, sure, John. Thanks. Yeah, Eric Newcomer, CTO WSO2, joined just about a year ago. Before that, spent about 10 years financial services, and before that, had a similar CTO role at Iona Technologies. So for me, it's a bit back to the future. I was in technology, into financial services, and back to technology.
Yeah, great to have you, Eric. Kyle?
Yeah, I'm Kyle Fowler. I'm our Director of Engineering for Developer and Consumer Products at Foursquare. Been with the company for almost 10 years now, working mostly on our developer side.
Perfect. Okay, we'll jump back to you, Eric, on the metrics and KPI for measuring API project success. What are your thoughts on that? How do you guys measure API project success? How should it be measured? Let's start with this.
Well, some of it's going to be empirical. Some of it's going to be measuring the stats, the analytics that you collect. So first of all, it's very important when you're publishing APIs, especially external APIs, to turn on the analytics to get the data and be able to look through it and see how many people are using it, what's the usage rate. You need to make sure it's a good experience everybody has. You need to make sure it's going to scale and you get the response time that you want. You got to check all those things. You got to check how it's being used. And, on the other side, empirically, or you might say in terms of a user experience, you want to make sure you're giving them a good user experience. And there, I think you want to be able to check what kind of feedback you're getting from your customers and talk to them. So I think there's the kinds of measurements where you're collecting the statistics and seeing what the usage rates are, seeing what their volumes are, seeing what the stickiness might be for them. And on the other side, you've got to get some soft data from talking to consumers of the APIs and make sure they're getting what they need out of it.
Yeah, Kyle, what are your thoughts on API project success?
Yeah, for us, I think we kind of take a two-prong approach. We have a free version of our developer product and a paid version. So it's both, recurring revenue, how many customers are willing to pay for the API product, and then on the more independent software developer side, our engagement with the community, number of Stack Overflow issues created around the API engagement, and then all the things that Eric mentioned around latency responses, things of that nature. But from a business perspective, we want to grow, different metrics based on different sides of the business, where we want to grow our independent usage as well as our recurring revenue business.
Yeah, and we want to be able, as a vendor, supplier of API management software, we want to be able to support all those kinds of metrics for you when you, not that you're a customer of ours, but for customers who are interested in those metrics, especially the value metrics, the consumption, the monetization, very important.
Yeah, and I think both of you guys kind of come at it from different perspectives, right? I think as far as Foursquare goes, Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys create a API product, but it's more of a product that you guys are monetizing your APIs, and then Eric at WSO2 now, It's more about helping companies with their APIs on the other side of it.
Exactly.
And so, coming at it from two different perspectives, I think API projects can be, both from a money-making engine for a company, but also software that helps companies monetize those API projects that they have internally, or those that data that they have internally as well. Let's talk a little bit about some of the most common challenges facing a team working on API projects, and what advice would you give some of those teams facing some of those challenges? Kyle, we're going to start with you this time.
All right, well, I can just read a slide from my upcoming talk in an hour here, since that's the title of one of those slides. I think for me, building APIs, one of the biggest challenges is general usability for customers. I think a lot of API success comes on how easy it is to use and how well it solves the user experiences or the challenges that your customers are trying to solve. If an API is hard to use, hard to understand, is inconsistent, they're just going to churn and find something else that is easier to work with. I think it's like, for me, making those decisions up front, making sure that the developer experience of using your product, you keep that bar high, will have a lasting impact on the success of the product.
Eric?
Yeah, absolutely. And now it's more about the developer than ever and providing good developer experience. We're spending a lot of time trying to improve our products to make them very easy for our developers to use for just those reasons. I would also add that, along the lines of a best practice sort of generalization, is to start with the kind of service that the business is providing. Kyle, working for Foursquare, you have an API that provides capabilities for businesses. And that API design you're talking about that's easy to use needs to be aligned very well with the functionality of the business that you're providing. And I think some of our customers don't get that as well as you've articulated it, Kyle. I think sometimes they'll start with the other end and say, I've got a function I want to expose out as an API. And they may not think about how the customer sees that service from the business point of view. They'll think I'm just going to expose out this technical capability with an API. And of course, they're going to want to use it because we use it. But it's a different ballgame once you cross that boundary between internal systems and external systems, start making things customer facing. You really got to think about the business service you're providing with that API.
Yeah, and for us, riff here, our original API product was the same API that powered our consumer applications. So we built it for us. And happened to expose it to others. And as we've gone along, we feel like the growth of that API kind of plateaued because it was so tightly tied to how we saw the product, and needed to shift our thinking to how our customers wanted to interact with our API products and make changes to address that gap.
Yeah, a lot of people go through that journey. We had the same challenge when I was at Citi with our APIs. Something else maybe important to mention in this context is standards, because customers who are going to use your API are going to expect it to become a standard, a web standard, if nothing else. But now we have other standards, async API standards and GraphQL and webhooks. And I think when we're thinking about providing these, as much as we can adhere to the standard as closely as possible, I think it makes it also easier for customers to understand and consume something.
Yeah, I think when we talk about, and Kyle, you mentioned this here, talking about API design, talking about our strategies around APIs and company strategies, a lot of it does start with, or should start with, developer experience, from the perspective that we have running the shows that we do. We work with a lot of developers. You're running the developer team over there on the API side. How important is developer experience to the design of APIs? Does it matter 100%? And then, Eric, you can chime in here too. You mentioned you need to have pick up and uptake on the business side as well, right? So even if you have perfectly designed API for the developer side of things, if the business side of the equation doesn't really pick up on it, you're going to get the funding for it. You're not going to get the spend for it, whatever it may be. What's the happy medium here as far as that goes for API strategy and design?
Yeah, for us, we spent probably 2 months before we wrote any code, just planning what our developer experience would be. We knew that we wanted to offer flexibility to select data from schemas in responses, and how we made that happen would impact billing, since different fields get charged at different rates. And so we had to know ahead of time how we wanted to enable that, to make sure that the billing experience was good for customers, that the latency and resolution of those fields was fast. And so like before, we spent a very long time before we wrote any code, just walking through those things. Similar. I'll say this later also, but like similar to any UI product, you are designing something. You need to do testing. You need to, before you write anything, because kind of once you put out an API, it's almost written in stone once you get customers on it, and at some level. So it's very important. I think it was the most critical thing that we did at the beginning, was take a step back, not rush to pushing something out that we would be stuck with.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, comparing to user interface design. This is something you can't really fix after the fact very well if you don't get it right in the beginning, and very much similar for APIs. APIs also, though, are part of a larger ecosystem. You mentioned the UX that calls the API is an important factor, and similarly the back-end systems for many companies that the APIs access and integrate with to provide that great experience are things that also need to be looked at very carefully. If you're going to have a great customer experience, it's not just the user interface, but how that user interface accesses the APIs that access the backends and interact with the data that powers those APIs. So I would just add to that, which I think is a great analogy, that you need to do the design work up front as much as possible, but you also want to consider where that API fits in the whole ecosystem of the user interface back to the server.
We have a question from the chat, and I think this one's relevant to where we're talking right now. We're talking about API design specs. What, as far as the, and this may, you guys may have different answers to this, but there are different standards, various standards that are out there now and have been on API designs. How do those standards, and what are the key standards, and how did some of them change as you approached and pivoted your API design?
Well, I could start. I guess I brought it up, so I'll start on it. I think it helps make the design, simplify the design process, because if you think about the Open API standard and the recently, within the last year, released Async API standard,
right,
both of them provide a great framework to fill in, if you will, for how you do a design. So you have the framework. When you do the design, the standard sort of shows you the pieces that you need for the design. And on top of that, because people start to build tools on the standards, you get a lot of benefit from generating code, or code that generates the standards. You get tests that you can generate. So it just sort of streamlines the whole process from beginning to end by having that framework.
Yeah, and I think the standards provide a good base, but then there's plenty of room to make decisions on top of the base. Authentication, path structure, response formats, schemas. Like there are ways you can riff, but I think what the important part is being consistent. You pick a baseline standard, and then whatever you do on top of that should be internally consistent across all of your APIs. If you have multiple, they should behave the same way. The user should expect the same thing, and so picking a base standard and then your own standards on top of that you enforce for all of your APIs is important for your developer experience.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about further in on the design now. So you have an API project, Kyle, as you mentioned. You guys didn't write code for months, talking through the entire project itself before it's there. Now you have an API out in the wild, right? You've designed an API, you've strategized around building this API before that, and now you've put this API out there, whether it's for monetization purposes or just to get more users on your system. What do you guys? How is the role, and this may be how it's used, in your companies, or how you may see it being used, or ideally, the role of feedback, the role of the user experience, and how that user or those users are seeing your API, and how do you guys integrate that feedback into ongoing design or ongoing iterations? Okay.
For us, it's a multi-tiered approach. We have sales engineers who are sitting with customers before they buy, collecting feedback on functionality, design, pulling that in. We have our customer support engineers who are sitting with customers after they've purchased and collecting feedback from active customers. And we have weekly sync meetings with both those teams from the product and engineering side to listen to feedback, ingest those, put them on our board, on our backlog or on our future design plans, and then work that back out to the customer as we move along. But I think it's important for us to have people constantly communicating with customers and then churning that crank continually.
We're it's a little bit different take for us. We're working on products that enable API development, deployment, and management. We're working on a next-gen API management product called Choreo, and we think about this in terms of getting product iterations out. It's in beta right now, and so we encourage our customers who've got API products of their own to take a similar approach as a software product company would take to think about APIs and applications, digital applications as products, get them out there, get the feedback, iterate, put in the agile deployment process that allows you to churn is the wrong word, iterate quickly and get the feedback quickly and put it in, incorporate it, and get it back out. So I think the same kinds of things that software companies have started to do with pushing out betas and getting reactions, getting feedback and tuning and tweaking are what we would give advice to people creating digital apps and APIs that support them as well.
So let me ask you guys another question on, in new design, APIs have been around for 20 years, right? But we've really seen almost in the last 10 years, a really big uptake on APIs, and even in the last 18 months with the pandemic, we talked about this in some of the fireside chats we did yesterday, just the acceleration that you've started to see with utilizing more and more APIs, and what at least we've seen on our side, APIs have kind of gone through this, they were very hot back in the day in 2000, let's say 12 and 13. You had lots of API startups. They got consolidated. They got pulled into a lot of bigger companies. But what we're starting to see again today is resurgence around APIs and their usability, and the idea that many more companies are utilizing APIs to monetize. I think, Kyle, Foursquare is one of those companies that started doing it early on as far as monetizing an API. And then Eric, WSO2 has been around the block for a while, building APIs or helping companies build out APIs, understanding the API strategy for a long time. What do you guys see as some of the newer technologies and architectures, and how do they play in to designing API projects, right? So APIs, like I said, have been around for 20 years, but Kubernetes has not, right? Microservices has not. How do those new technologies and architectures, and ones that are will be coming over the next couple of years, play into and have an impact on API projects and innovation, or don't they? Kyle, you want to take this one?
I was going to kick this one over to Eric. I can follow up, but yeah.
Yeah, so it is interesting. As you said, 20 years ago, APIs were existing, but we also had SOAP and WSDL and different ways of communicating over the internet and even internally. But I think the world has really moved much more toward the web programming model than even 10, 15 years ago. And I think a lot of that has to do with success of the cloud. Cloud native programming is really built on the same kind of model of state sharing and RESTful APIs as the web is based on. So the web has kind of come into the enterprise, meaning that as we move more and more to the cloud and microservices with APIs, we're moving more and more to kind of a web programming model, and APIs are really becoming the programmable web, as we sort of saw years ago. But now it's really settled in, and the standards have evolved to the point at which this is really becoming a reality. I think another interesting aspect of this is the proliferation of different types of APIs that have come out as well. You have GraphQL types of APIs in addition to HTTP-based ones. You have gRPC types of APIs, and you have async APIs, which I think is a huge step forward and brings in a whole additional category of applications to the API world. So I think we're seeing a lot of that great development. And as you mentioned with Kubernetes and the cloud, you also have the automated deployment that allows you to get into these agile feedback loops with your microservices and break the problem up into discrete functions, which really also seems to help spur the APIs, the need for more APIs.
Yeah, and when we see that in what we're building, and that we deploy new versions of our API product every other day, essentially. We can continually make improvements. Whether it be behind the scenes, not schema breaking, but we can constantly churn out improvements whenever we get feedback, focus on latency, things like that. GraphQL is one that we teetered on the edge of deciding to use GraphQL, but I think the growth of that in market will change things in the future as the tooling around it gets more mature. I think the flexibility that it offers developers has the opportunity to change things once the tooling catches up for the more mainstream. I think it's still my take. That's still a little bit too expert.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think it's still early days because you have a whole GraphQL server side that you have to set up, and there's not enough help yet in the tooling for that. I agree. On the other side, the async APIs, though, bolt right into an existing paradigm with messaging and WebSockets, and so I think that's likely to take off much more quickly.
We have time for one more question, guys. And it was something I was going to touch on, but our last two questions in the chat have to do with security. And it's something that we've seen on our side in tracking the API economy and the API industry for the last 10 years, that at the beginning, it was all about data and getting the data outside of the enterprise or outside of the company and being able to share it. But we've now come sort of full circle, and because there are so many instances we hear about sort of on a almost weekly basis of a security breach through an API that was just unprotected. Let's talk a little bit about security and API security and how important that is. So one of the questions was, do you build API security into the APIs from the beginning, or is it something you guys bolt on at the end? And do you use things like the OWASP API top 10? How do you guys treat security? And is it becoming, and are you seeing it becoming a more important issue, both from the user side and then also from the the customer side? So Eric, we'll start with you on this one.
Sure. I was working in the security field at Citi just before joining WSO2, and we had published a lot of APIs, and API security was a big topic for us. We would have cases where dev teams would push an API out without talking with the security team, and it was a big effort. So yeah, the question about getting it done first, absolutely. And it's similar, again, to use the UI design. It's something that's very hard to retrofit if you don't design for it in the beginning. I'm seeing a kind of a trend called security as code that helps apply this problem by providing code libraries early in the development cycle to help developers who may not have a lot of skills or background in security put it in right there, so that you have conformance to company security policies and standards in the code that you're building for the APIs before you deploy them. And I think that's really going to help once we see that trend take off more.
Kyle?
Yeah, and for us, in the months of planning that I mentioned, our security team was heavily involved, a lot around the authentication and creation of tokens, and resource asset access, and they preached pretty hard the OWASP top 10. Made sure that we were sticking to that. They were very integral to our original design. So, like Eric said from the start, security is important. Even if you think you're just providing read-only services and no user PII or anything, it's a good conversation to have.
Yeah, if they can break in, they will, no matter what it is, and you never know where they're going to go once they do that, right? So,
exactly.
Absolutely.
Okay, guys, I think that's all the time we have. Appreciate you guys joining me. The nice high-level discussion on API design and API project management. Thanks again to you, Eric, and to you, Kyle, for being here at the Fireside Chat. We will be back on the main stage in about 3 minutes for our next talk. So again, from the main stage, thanks again.
Thanks,
All right.
thanks everyone.
Guys.
Bye.
See ya.